You are about to hear something that might change the way you look at almost every purchase you make starting today, because if you pause for just a moment and imagine opening your banking app 1 year from now and realizing that thousands of dollars quietly disappeared into habits you barely even noticed, you begin to understand why most people feel like they are working harder every year but somehow moving slower financially. And the shocking truth is that the modern economy has become incredibly good at creating spending behaviors that feel harmless in the moment, but accumulate into massive financial leaks over time that silently drain wealth before people ever realize what is happening. Picture the scenario for a moment because it represents the daily reality for millions of households across the country, where someone wakes up early in the morning, grabs their phone, scrolls through notifications, orders coffee on an app, maybe schedules lunch delivery later, pays a few subscriptions automatically charged overnight, and within the first 2 hours of the day several small financial decisions have already happened without conscious thought, and each one feels tiny, convenient, and normal. Yet when multiplied across months and years, those same decisions quietly transform into thousands of dollars that could have been invested, saved, or used to build long-term stability instead of funding systems designed specifically to capture small pieces of your income again and again. The numbers behind this reality are impossible to ignore once you look at them carefully, because the average American household spent more than $78,000 in consumer expenditures in 2024, while wages increased at a much slower pace, which means the gap between earning and spending is expanding every single year. And when that gap grows large enough, people begin to experience something that economists rarely explain clearly, which is the psychological pressure of constantly feeling like money disappears faster than it arrives, even when income technically increases. This is where the story becomes fascinating, because most people assume inflation is the main villain responsible for the situation. But inflation alone cannot explain the massive change in consumer economics that has taken place over the last decade, because what has actually happened is something far more strategic, where corporations across multiple industries discovered that the most profitable way to increase revenue is not necessarily by improving products, but by engineering pricing models, subscription structures, convenient systems, and psychological triggers that encourage consumers to spend more frequently while noticing it less. Think about how many purchases in your life today happen automatically, without requiring real thought, because subscriptions renew silently. Delivery apps store your payment details. Buy now, pay later systems break larger purchases into smaller numbers that feel easier to accept emotionally. And streaming platforms encourage you to keep multiple memberships active at the same time, even though you only watch one show at a time, which means a modern consumer environment has essentially removed most of the friction that once forced people to pause and ask a simple but powerful question before spending money, which is whether the purchase is truly worth it. When friction disappears from spending decisions, the result is predictable, because convenience becomes the dominant factor driving behavior, and convenience almost always costs more than people realize, which is exactly why some of the most common purchases in 2026 have quietly evolved into what can only be described as financial traps that deliver less value than they once did, while costing dramatically more than they used to. The first example of this transformation can be seen in something that millions of people use every single week without thinking twice about it, which is food delivery apps. Because platforms like DoorDash, Uber Eats, and Grubhub completely changed how people access restaurants, but they also changed the economics of food in a way that most customers never fully examine when they tap the order button on their phone. Restaurants on these platforms pay commission fees that range between 15 and 30% for every order that passes through the app, which means a restaurant cannot simply absorb those costs without losing profit. So the prices you see inside delivery apps are often significantly higher than the prices listed inside the actual restaurant itself. And research consistently shows that menu items inside delivery platforms can cost roughly 25% more than the exact same food purchased in person, even before any additional service fees are added. Now consider what happens after those inflated menu prices appear on your screen, because the app then adds delivery fees, service fees, small order fees if your purchase does not reach a certain threshold, and of course the driver tip, which is completely reasonable but still increases the final cost significantly. And suddenly a meal that would have cost $12 if you simply walked into the restaurant can easily reach $20 or more through the app, which represents an 80% markup for the convenience of avoiding a short drive. When someone orders delivery occasionally, this difference might not seem significant, but when the habit becomes weekly or even multiple times per week, the numbers become impossible to ignore, because a person paying an extra $15 per order twice per week ends up spending more than $1,500 per year simply for the convenience of having someone else pick up their food. And when that same amount of money is invested with average long-term market returns, it can compound into several times its original value over the course of decades. This is the subtle mechanism through which modern spending habits slowly reshape financial outcomes, because no single purchase feels dramatic enough to trigger concern. Yet the repeated pattern creates a silent transfer of wealth from individual bank accounts to corporate profits, while the consumer remains largely unaware of how much value is being extracted from what appears to be a simple convenient service. And once you begin seeing these patterns in one category of spending, you start noticing them everywhere else in the economy, where familiar purchases quietly became more expensive, while delivering the same or sometimes even less value than they once did, which is why understanding these shifts has become one of the most powerful financial advantages anyone can develop in a world where awareness itself is often the only defense against systems designed to separate people from their money without triggering resistance. If you follow the flow of money through everyday habits long enough, you begin to notice something deeply fascinating about the modern consumer world, which is that many of the most expensive financial decisions people make today rarely feel like big decisions in the moment they happen, because they are disguised as lifestyle conveniences, social norms, or harmless routines that repeat quietly day after day until years pass and the accumulated cost becomes large enough to reshape someone's financial future without them ever feeling a single dramatic moment where the damage occurred. This is exactly how spending psychology works in the real world, because human brains are not naturally designed to evaluate long-term compounding outcomes every time a purchase happens, and companies understand this weakness extremely well, which is why the systems surrounding modern spending are intentionally designed to reduce the emotional weight of paying while increasing the emotional satisfaction of acquiring something quickly and effortlessly. Think about the last time you purchased something online with a single tap of your phone, because the payment information was already saved, the shipping was already calculated, the checkout process was reduced to a single confirmation button, and within seconds the transaction was complete, while the brain experienced a small rush of satisfaction from acquiring something new without any meaningful friction standing between the desire and the purchase. That tiny rush of satisfaction is not accidental, because the entire architecture of modern digital commerce has been built around the concept of minimizing the pause between impulse and payment, and the shorter that pause becomes, the more frequently spending occurs, which is precisely why companies invest billions of dollars designing interfaces that feel smooth, fast, and emotionally rewarding even when the long-term financial impact on the consumer is negative. Once you begin recognizing this pattern, you start seeing it in places where people rarely question their spending habits, and one of the most powerful examples of this shift appears in the way people buy cars today, because transportation used to be viewed primarily as a functional necessity that allowed someone to move from one place to another efficiently. But over time, the car market evolved into something much closer to a lifestyle signaling system, where vehicles represent status, identity, and personal success rather than simple utility. The financial mathematics of buying a brand new car reveal a reality that most dealerships never emphasize during the buying process, because the moment a new car leaves the dealership lot, it typically loses around 20% of its value instantly, which means someone purchasing a $48,000 vehicle effectively watches nearly $10,000 evaporate within the first hour of ownership, simply due to depreciation. That single financial event represents more lost value than many households save in an entire year, yet it happens quietly because the excitement of driving a new car temporarily overshadows the invisible financial loss that just occurred, and by the time the owner begins noticing the depreciation months later, the decision has already been locked into a multi-year loan that cannot easily be reversed. The situation becomes even more complicated when financing enters the equation, because many buyers place small down payments on expensive vehicles and finance the majority of the purchase over 5 or 6 years, which often creates a scenario known as negative equity, where the outstanding loan balance remains higher than the actual value of the car for a significant portion of the loan period. This means the owner technically owes more money than the car itself is worth for years after the purchase, which traps them inside the loan, because selling the car would require paying additional cash just to close the financing gap. And the only reason this situation feels normal is because millions of people experience it simultaneously, and the entire industry operates under the assumption that this financial structure is simply the standard way to buy transportation. But when you compare that model to the strategy quietly followed by many financially successful individuals, the difference becomes extremely revealing, because research on millionaire spending habits consistently shows that the majority of wealthy individuals drive reliable vehicles several years old rather than brand new luxury models, and they often pay significantly less for transportation than the average middle-income household, despite having far more financial capacity to spend. The reason behind this behavior is simple but powerful, because experienced wealth builders understand that depreciation is one of the fastest ways to destroy money, and they treat cars as tools rather than status symbols, which allows them to redirect thousands of dollars every year away from rapidly losing assets and toward investments that grow instead of shrink. Once that shift in perspective happens, the entire landscape of consumer spending begins to look different, because you start asking questions that most marketing systems hope consumers never ask, such as whether a purchase is truly improving long-term quality of life or simply providing a temporary emotional reward that fades quickly after the transaction occurs. This question becomes particularly interesting when examining the way people spend money on food outside the home, because dining out used to represent a relatively affordable social activity that allowed people to enjoy a meal without investing time in cooking. But the economics of restaurants have changed dramatically over the last several years due to rising labor costs, higher rent for commercial spaces, increased ingredient prices, and a competitive environment that forces businesses to maintain high profit margins just to survive. As a result, restaurant prices have climbed dramatically in many areas, with some studies showing increases of more than 35% compared to prices from just a few years earlier, which means the same casual dinner that once felt like a modest treat now often costs twice as much without delivering a significantly improved experience. When the people sit down for a casual dinner today, the bill can easily approach $100 once appetizers, drinks, and tips are included. And while that might feel like a normal evening out, it quietly represents a spending pattern that can exceed $10,000 per year for households that dine out regularly. The fascinating part of this situation is that many of the most profitable items in restaurant menus are not the food itself but the beverages, because drinks often carry extremely high markups compared to their ingredient cost, which allows restaurants to generate strong margins even when food profits are relatively small. Understanding this business structure changes how someone views the experience of eating out, because it becomes clear that part of the price paid at a restaurant is not just for the meal, but for the entire environment, service staff, location rent, and the psychological satisfaction of being served rather than cooking yourself. None of these elements are inherently negative, yet recognizing them makes it easier to decide consciously when the experience is worth the cost, and when it might be more beneficial financially and nutritionally to prepare meals at home instead. Cooking at home often provides better control over ingredients, portion sizes, and total spending, while also allowing people to experiment creatively with food rather than simply selecting items from a fixed menu. And once someone becomes comfortable with basic cooking skills, the cost difference between restaurant meals and home-prepared meals becomes surprisingly dramatic. A dinner that might cost $40 at a restaurant can often be prepared at home for less than $10 using quality ingredients, which means each decision to cook rather than dine out quietly preserves $30 that could be invested, saved, or used for experiences that deliver longer-lasting satisfaction. This concept of redirecting small financial decisions toward long-term outcomes becomes even more powerful when applied consistently across multiple spending categories, because each individual habit may only represent a few dollars per day, yet together they create an entire financial ecosystem that either builds wealth gradually or erodes it gradually, depending on how those habits are structured. And perhaps the most interesting discovery people make once they start examining these patterns closely is that many expensive habits do not actually provide lasting happiness proportional to their cost, because the human brain adapts quickly to routine experiences, meaning the excitement generated by frequent purchases often fades faster than the financial impact they create. This phenomenon is known as hedonic adaptation, where repeated exposure to pleasurable experiences gradually reduces the emotional reward they produce, which explains why buying something new can feel exciting at first but becomes normal very quickly, encouraging people to seek the next purchase in order to recreate the same feeling again. Companies are fully aware of this psychological cycle and frequently design products and services that encourage repeated consumption, specifically because they understand that the initial novelty will fade, creating demand for upgrades, replacements, or additional variations that keep the spending loop active. Once someone understands this dynamic, the path towards stronger financial control becomes clearer, because the most effective strategy is not necessarily eliminating every luxury or convenience, but becoming aware of the true cost behind each habit and deciding consciously which ones genuinely improve life and which ones simply exist because they were never questioned. As you continue examining the patterns behind modern spending, something even more revealing begins to emerge, which is the realization that the most powerful financial advantages in 2026 do not necessarily belong to the people earning the most money, but rather to the people who understand how the systems around them are designed and who choose intentionally which parts of those systems they participate in and which ones they quietly step away from. This shift in awareness changes everything because once someone begins observing the structure behind everyday purchases, the world starts to look less like a collection of random expenses and more like a carefully constructed environment where companies compete aggressively for small slices of consumer income by building habits that feel natural enough to continue without resistance. One of the most obvious examples of this transformation can be seen in the world of digital entertainment, where streaming services regionally promise to revolutionize the way people watch television by offering unlimited content at low monthly prices, creating a powerful narrative that encouraged millions of households to cancel expensive cable subscriptions in favor of a more flexible and affordable model. At the beginning, that promise actually held true because a single streaming platform provided a massive library of movies and shows for a modest fee, making it feel like a breakthrough moment in entertainment economics where consumers finally gained more control over what they watched and how much they paid. But over time, the industry began to evolve in a direction that few people predicted, because every major media company realized that controlling its own streaming platform would allow it to capture subscription revenue directly rather than licensing content to competitors, which led to an explosion of new platforms each holding exclusive rights to specific shows, movies, or sports programming. The result of this fragmentation is that the original simplicity of streaming slowly disappeared as households began stacking multiple subscriptions in order to maintain access to the variety of content they once received through a single service. And what started as a $10 monthly expense gradually expanded into a bundle of services, costing far more than many cable packages ever did. The fascinating part of this situation is that most consumers did not experience a single dramatic moment when they decided to spend more money on streaming, because the subscriptions were added gradually over time, one platform at a time, often triggered by the release of a specific show or exclusive series that created enough excitement to justify another monthly payment. Before long, many households found themselves paying for 5 or 6 different streaming services simultaneously, even though they could realistically only watch content from one or two platforms during any given week, which means the majority of that subscription spending quietly funds access to content that may not even be used regularly. This is a perfect example of how modern subscription models rely heavily on inertia, because once a recurring payment is established, it tends to continue automatically until someone actively decides to cancel it, and many people postpone that decision indefinitely because the individual monthly charge feels small enough to ignore. Yet when those small charges accumulate across an entire year, they often represent hundreds or even thousands of dollars that could have been directed towards savings or investments instead, demonstrating once again how the most significant financial outcomes often rise from patterns rather than individual decisions. Another area where spending patterns have changed dramatically involves technology upgrades, because consumer electronics companies release new versions of their flagship products every year, with marketing campaigns designed to create excitement around incremental improvements that rarely transform the everyday user experience as dramatically as advertisements suggest. A smartphone released this year might feature a slightly faster processor, a marginally improved camera sensor, or a redesigned exterior, yet the core functionality of the device remains essentially identical to models produced just a few years earlier, meaning the practical difference for most users is far smaller than the marketing narrative implies. Despite this reality, millions of people replace perfectly functional devices on a regular cycle, simply because the release of a new model triggers the psychological feeling that older devices have suddenly become outdated, even though they continue performing the same tasks just as effectively as they did before the announcement. This phenomenon is amplified by the concept of planned obsolescence, where manufacturers design ecosystems of software updates, battery degradation, and compatibility limitations that gradually encourage replacement rather than repair, ensuring that the upgrade cycle remains active even when the physical device itself could easily last several more years. When someone spends over $1,000 on a new smartphone every 2 years, the annualized cost of that habit becomes significant, especially when compared to the alternative of purchasing devices 1 or 2 generations behind the latest release at dramatically lower prices while experiencing nearly identical functionality. The financial difference between those two strategies over a decade can easily reach several $1,000s, and when that difference is invested rather than spent, it becomes even more powerful due to the effect of compounding returns over time. Compounding is one of the most fascinating forces in personal finance, because small amounts of money invested consistently grow into surprisingly large amounts over long periods, which means every dollar that avoids unnecessary spending becomes a potential seed for future financial stability. This is why many experienced investors emphasize the importance of controlling lifestyle inflation, where income increases lead to proportional increases in spending, instead of allowing additional earnings to strengthen long-term financial security. The danger of lifestyle inflation is that it often happens gradually, as people become accustomed to higher levels of comfort, convenience, and luxury without realizing that maintaining those upgrades requires continuously earning more money simply to sustain the same standard of living. If income growth slows or unexpected financial challenges appear, the lifestyle built on those higher spending habits suddenly becomes difficult to maintain, creating stress that could have been avoided if some portion of the additional income had been directed towards savings or investments instead. This dynamic becomes particularly relevant when examining large one-time expenses that are heavily influenced by social expectations, such as weddings, which have evolved into elaborate events that can cost tens of thousands of dollars, even though the legal and emotional foundation of marriage itself requires only a simple ceremony. The wedding industry has developed an entire ecosystem of specialized services, where vendors charge premium prices specifically because the event is labeled as a wedding, and couples often feel pressure to meet those expectations because the celebration represents an important milestone they want to remember positively. However, the financial implications of spending $35,000 or more on a single day become significant when compared to alternative uses for that same money, such as building an emergency fund, reducing debt, or contributing to a down payment on a home. This does not mean celebrations should be eliminated entirely, because meaningful experiences with family and friends can create memories that last a lifetime. But recognizing the opportunity cost behind large expenses helps couples make decisions that balance emotional value with long-term financial goals.